Hello guys, welcome to Whispered Ages channel. 2.5 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000, somewhere on the dry savanna of what we now call East Africa, a small group of bodies lie curled together in the dark. There is no clock. There is no calendar. There is no concept, even, of a year, in the way we understand it. There is only the slow wheel of light and dark, the cold that comes before dawn, and the bodies pressed close for warmth. Tonight, like most nights, the world is mostly quiet. Somewhere far off, something calls into the dark, a low, rolling sound that might be a lion, might be a hyena, might be nothing at all, just wind moving through dry grass. Nobody startles. They have heard this sound, or sounds like it, every night of their lives. The body learns, after enough nights, which sounds deserve fear and which do not. This is not a story about a single person, a single tribe, a single moment in time. It is a story stitched together from many places and many millennia, from the bones left behind, from the stone tools scattered across ancient riverbeds, from the chemical traces in old soil, from the careful, patient work of thousands of researchers who have spent their lives trying to answer a deceptively simple question. What did they actually do, all day? Not the dramatic moments. Not the mammoth hunts or the cave paintings or the migrations across forgotten land bridges. The other moments. The long, quiet stretches in between. The waking up. The walking. The waiting. The small tasks that filled most hours of most days for most of human existence. Because here is something worth sitting with, as you settle into wherever you are right now, blankets pulled up, eyes growing heavy. For the overwhelming majority of the time our species and its ancestors have existed, life moved at the pace we are about to describe. Slow. Repetitive. Tied to light and dark, to hunger and rest, to the small rhythms of bodies moving through a world that did not yet have names for most of what filled it. We tend to imagine early humans as living lives of constant danger and dramatic event. And there were dangers, certainly. But danger, it turns out, was not most of the day. Most of the day was much quieter than that. Much more like waiting. Much more like rest. Much more, in fact, like the long unhurried stretch of hours you are settling into right now. So let us walk through one of those days. Not a single specific day, no record exists detailed enough for that, but a day built carefully from everything we know. A composite. A reconstruction. As close as careful science can bring us to standing quietly at the edge of an ancient camp, watching the world wake up. Let's begin before the sun. In the hour before dawn, the African sky begins its slow change. Black gives way to a deep, bruised blue. Stars that have wheeled overhead all night start to thin out, fading one by one, as though someone were slowly turning down 1,000 small lamps. This is usually when the first person stirs. We don't know exactly who woke first, in any given band, on any given morning, deep in the Pleistocene. But sleep researchers who study the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth today. Groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, or the San of the Kalahari, have noticed something remarkable. Sleep, in societies without artificial light, without alarm clocks, without the glow of screens late into the night, tends to follow a particular shape. People go to sleep a few hours after sundown. They wake gradually, sometimes more than once during the night, drifting in and out of light sleep before the deeper sleep that follows. And they rise, almost without exception, before or right around sunrise. There is no slamming alarm. No sudden jolt from REM sleep into panicked wakefulness. Just a slow drift upward into consciousness, following the slow drift of light into the sky. Imagine, for a moment, what that absence might have felt like. No grogginess born of unnatural light kept on too late. No sense of being torn from sleep before the body was ready. Just a body that had rested as long as the night was long, lifting itself up because the dark was thinning and the work of the day, gathering, walking, watching, was waiting. The person who stirs first is often, anthropological observation suggests, an older member of the group. Older adults across many traditional societies tend to sleep lighter and wake earlier than younger adults. A pattern so consistent across human cultures that some researchers believe it may be partly biological, woven into us by deep evolutionary time itself. Perhaps there was an advantage, once, in having someone older and wiser awake first, listening to the quiet, checking that the night had passed without incident, before the rest of the group stirred. So picture her, we will call her an elder, though of course no name survives, no specific identity persists across 2 million years. Sitting up slowly in the gray pre-dawn light. Around her, the others sleep on, curled together for warmth, breathing slow and even. The fire from the night before, if there was one, has burned down to a faint bed of orange coals, pulsing gently in the dark like a small, patient heart. She sits for a while, simply listening. This listening, this quiet attentiveness to the sounds of the waking world, was, in a very real sense, one of the most important activities of the entire day, even though it produced nothing, built nothing, fed no one directly. The world had to be assessed each morning before it could be moved through safely. Were the night sounds the same as always? Was there a new scent on the wind? Had anything changed? Survival depended on 1,000 small acts of attention like this one, repeated so many mornings, by so many people, across so much time, that they became a kind of background hum to human existence, invisible because they were so constant, easy to overlook because they so rarely amounted to a story worth telling. But they were the foundation of everything else. By the time the sky has shifted from blue to the first soft amber of true dawn, more of the group is awake. There is little urgency to this waking. No one springs up. Hunter-gatherer mornings, by every account we have, both from direct observation of remaining traditional societies and from careful inference about the deeper past, tend to begin slowly. A child might roll over, blink at the brightening sky, and simply lie still a while longer, listening to the soft murmur of adult voices nearby. An adult might stretch, joints cracking faintly, before sitting up to tend the fire. The fire, if the band has fire, and by the time we reach perhaps 400,000 years ago, most human groups likely did, needs attention each morning. Coals that glowed all night need new fuel, need breath blown gently across them, need small twigs added before larger branches, in the same careful sequence every single morning of every single year. This is worth pausing on, because it is easy to imagine fire-making as a dramatic skill, performed occasionally with great effort, two sticks rubbed together in some crisis. The reality, for most of human history, once fire was mastered, was far less dramatic and far more domestic. Fire was tended. Fire was kept. It was less like an invention used in emergencies and more like a quiet companion that lived with the group, that had to be fed and watched, the way one might tend a small, faithful animal that gave warmth and light in exchange for care. Someone, often, ethnographic studies suggest, an older child or a woman of the group, though roles certainly varied across cultures and time periods, kneels by the coals. Breath, slow and steady, coaxes a thread of smoke into a small flame. Dry grass first. Then twigs. Then, when the flame is confident enough, slightly thicker branches, laid carefully, not thrown. The smell of smoke threading up into the cool morning air. This smell, more than almost anything else, might be the most consistent sensory experience linking a person standing in an African landscape 400,000 years ago to a person standing by a campfire today. Smoke smells like smoke. It has not changed. The wood may differ, the air may differ, but that particular scent, sharp, faintly sweet, threaded with mineral char, is one of the oldest continuous experiences in the human story. Around the rekindled fire, the group gathers loosely. Not in any formal way. There is no meeting called, no agenda set. People simply drift toward warmth and light, the way people have always drifted toward warmth and light, on cold mornings, in every age. Someone might check the supply of water from the day before, a hollowed gourd, perhaps, or simply memory of where the nearest water source lies. Someone else inspects yesterday's leftover food, deciding what, if anything, remains to eat before the group disperses to find more. These early morning minutes, fire tending, water checking, the soft murmur of waking voices, were, in their way, deeply administrative. Not administrative in the sense of paperwork or schedules, but in the oldest sense of the word, the daily management of small, necessary tasks that kept a group of bodies alive and functioning, one more day, in a world that offered no guarantees. It is easy, looking back across the vast gulf of time, to romanticize this morning scene, or alternatively to imagine it as grim and difficult. The truth researchers have pieced together sit somewhere quieter than either extreme. It was simply life. Routine. The particular, specific routine of a particular kind of creature, living a particular kind of existence, that had been refined and repeated for so long that it had become, in every meaningful sense, normal. Normal is underrated when we tell stories about the deep past. We reach for drama because drama is memorable. But normal is what actually filled the hours. Normal is what we are trying to find our way back to, now, in this telling. So let the fire crackle a little longer. Let the voices stay low. Let the light keep slowly filling the sky. There is no rush. There was never any rush, in the slow grammar of these mornings. Only the patient unfolding of another day, very much like the one before it, and very much like the one that would follow. As the sun fully clears the horizon, a deep red disk at first, climbing fast in the way the sun does near the equator, then paling to gold as it rises, the question of food becomes the morning's quiet center of gravity. Contrary to a once popular image of early humans as primarily aggressive big-game hunters, decades of research, drawing on studies of remaining hunter-gatherer societies, careful analysis of ancient teeth and bones, and examination of fossilized plant remains, paints a different, gentler picture for much of the deep past. For most Paleolithic groups, in most environments, the bulk of daily calories likely came not from dramatic hunts but from gathering plants, tubers, nuts, fruits, insects, and small, easily caught animals. The famous modern studies of the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last societies on Earth still living substantially by hunting and gathering, found that on most days, more food, by weight, comes from gathering than from hunting. Tubers dug from the ground. Baobab fruit cracked open. Honey, when it can be found, prized above almost everything else for its concentrated sweetness. Berries. Greens. Small game caught almost incidentally along the way. This matters for understanding the actual texture of a day, because it means that for many ancient humans, breakfast, if we can even use that word, was not a feast prepared and consumed in one place. It was simpler. A handful of something gathered the evening before. A piece of dried meat from a previous kill, tough and smoky, gnawed slowly. Perhaps nothing at all, if supplies were thin, with the first real eating delayed until the morning's foraging had produced something. There is a particular quality to hunger in a life like this. Not the sharp, anxious hunger of someone fasting against their will in a world of abundance, but a kind of background hunger, present often, expected, factored into the rhythm of the day the way we factor in needing to check email or run an errand. Hunger meant simply that it was time to go find food. It was information, not crisis, most days, in most seasons. The children of the group, by every account from observed hunter-gatherer societies, tend to wake hungry and demanding in exactly the way children everywhere have always woken hungry and demanding. A small child tugs at an adult's arm. An older child, already fairly capable of finding small food on their own, insects, certain fruits, eggs from low nests, wanders off a short distance from camp, returning with whatever small offering the morning provided. This points to something important and often underappreciated about Paleolithic life: children were not idle. From a remarkably young age, sometimes as young as 3 or 4, according to studies of modern foraging societies, children begin to participate in small ways in the food economy of the group. Not through forced labor, but through play that gradually shaded into contribution. A child digging in dirt for fun discovers a tuber. A child climbing a tree for fun finds fruit. Skill and survival were taught largely through this kind of unstructured, low-stakes practice, repeated over years, until competence simply arrived, the way competence arrives in children everywhere, given enough time and enough freedom to explore. By mid-morning, then, most of the group has eaten something. Not a large meal, typically. Not a feast. Something modest, often eaten standing or walking rather than seated formally. The big eating, the real meal of substance, usually comes later. After the day's foraging or hunting has produced its results, when the whole group, or most of it, reconvenes. But for now, stomachs are quieted enough, light has fully arrived, and the day's real work, if we can call gathering food work, in a world where work and life were not yet separate categories, is ready to begin. The group, loosely, begins to disperse. Imagine following one small group of women and older children as they leave camp, walking in a loose, unhurried line across grassland turning gold in the strengthening light. This is, perhaps, the single most common activity of the Paleolithic day, repeated more often, by more people, across more millennia, than almost anything else our species has ever done, walking slowly across a landscape, eyes scanning the ground and the low brush, looking for food. It does not look dramatic. It does not look, from the outside, like very much is happening at all. And in a sense, that is exactly the point. This was the texture of most days, for most people, for most of human history. Not crisis. Not triumph. Just careful, patient looking. The skills involved, though, were anything but simple. A person gathering food in this way needed to carry, essentially, an enormous mental library. Knowledge of hundreds of plant species, which parts were edible, which were poisonous, which needed special preparation to be safe, which were only good at certain times of year, which grew in which kinds of soil, near which kinds of trees. This knowledge was not written down. It existed only in memory, passed from person to person, generation to generation, through demonstration and explanation and the simple act of walking together across the same landscapes, year after year, season after season. Researchers studying the Hadza and other contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have been struck, again and again, by the sheer depth of botanical knowledge ordinary members of these societies carry. Children as young as 6 or 7 can often identify dozens of plant species and explain, in detail, which parts are safe to eat and how to prepare them. This knowledge, multiplied across the deep past, across thousands of distinct human groups living in thousands of distinct environments, savanna, forest, coastline, mountain, desert, represents an almost unfathomable accumulated body of human understanding, almost none of which survives in any written form, because writing itself would not exist for hundreds of thousands of years. As the women walk, they talk. This too deserves attention, because it is easy to imagine the deep past as silent, but it almost certainly was not. Conversation, by every account from observed foraging societies, fills these gathering expeditions constantly. Gossip. Stories. Practical instruction passed from older women to younger ones. Jokes. The retelling of dreams from the night before. Speculation about the weather, about where animals might be found, about a neighboring group encountered some days back. Sound, in fact, may have served a practical purpose beyond simple social bonding. Talking while moving through brush alerts nearby animals to human presence, in many cases prompting them to flee quietly rather than be startled into a dangerous confrontation. Silence, paradoxically, can sometimes be more dangerous than noise, in landscapes shared with large, occasionally unpredictable animals. A child toddles along near the back of the group, occasionally scooped up onto a hip when the ground grows uneven, occasionally set down again to explore on unsteady legs. Carrying infants and toddlers was, by necessity, a near constant activity for women in foraging societies. Studies of groups like the Kalahari estimate that a mother might carry a young child for several thousand miles over the course of that child's early years, distributed across the cumulative walking of countless ordinary days. The pace of all this is, by modern standards, remarkably leisurely. Anthropologists studying time use among the Hadza and similar groups have found, again and again, a result that surprises most people encountering it for the first time. Total time spent on subsistence activities, gathering, hunting, food preparation, combined, often amounts to something in the range of 4 to 6 hours a day. Not 8. Not 12. Often less than a typical modern workday. This finding, first popularized by anthropologist Marshall Solins in the 1960s under the now famous phrase, the original affluent society, overturned an older assumption that hunter-gatherer life was a constant, exhausting scramble for survival. The data, gathered patiently across many studies in many different environments since then, has continued to support a more nuanced but still surprising picture. Foraging life, in many, though certainly not all, environments and time periods, left substantial hours of the day free from subsistence labor. What filled those free hours, we will return to. But first, let us stay with the gathering itself a while longer, because it filled so very many hours, across so very many lives. The women moved from one patch of low scrub to another, kneeling occasionally to dig with a simple wooden digging stick, one of the oldest tools in the human repertoire, predating stone tools in some lineages, simple in design but enormously effective, used to pry tubers and roots from compacted earth. The digging itself is steady, repetitive work. Loosen soil. Pry upward. Brush away dirt. Place the find into a carrying bag, often made of woven plant fiber or animal hide, slung across the body. Hours pass this way. The sun climbs. Sweat beads on skin already accustomed, through a lifetime of exposure, to outdoor heat in a way that feels almost unimaginable to those of us who spend most of our lives indoors, climate-controlled, insulated from the raw experience of weather. There is no sense of urgency in any single moment of this work, and yet the cumulative effect, over the slow hours, is substantial. Bags grow heavier, the group's collective food supply for the coming day or two steadily accumulates, root by root, fruit by fruit, insect by insect. Around midday, when the sun stands almost directly overhead and the heat becomes genuinely uncomfortable, the group typically pauses. We will return to this pause, this long, quiet midday rest, a little further along in our story. For now, let the gatherers settle briefly into whatever shade can be found. The thin shadow of an acacia tree, perhaps, or an outcrop of rock offering a sliver of relief from direct sun. They eat a little of what they have already found. They rest. Conversation slows to murmurs, then sometimes stops altogether as eyes grow heavy in the heat. This, too, was the rhythm of the day. Work, then rest. Movement, then stillness. The body's own signals, hunger, fatigue, heat, thirst. Providing a kind of built-in schedule far older and far more responsive than any clock could ever be. While the gatherers moved slowly across open grassland, a different small group, often, though not universally, composed of men, though the division of labor by sex varied considerably across different societies and time periods, moves with a different quality of attention entirely. Hunting, unlike gathering, required long stretches of intense focus interspersed with sudden bursts of action, all wrapped inside hours and hours of something that, to modern eyes, would look almost exactly like patient, uneventful walking. This is worth dwelling on, because popular imagination tends to picture the Paleolithic hunt as a dramatic, near-constant event, spears flying, mammoths charging, life-or-death confrontation around every turn. The reality, by every account anthropologists have managed to reconstruct, was far quieter and far more patient than that. Successful hunting, across almost every traditional hunting society ever studied, depends overwhelmingly on tracking skill, environmental knowledge, and sheer persistence rather than dramatic physical confrontation. A hunter moving across the landscape reads the ground the way a literate person reads a page. A faint indentation in dust. A bent blade of grass, still slowly straightening. Droppings, examined closely, their freshness and composition revealing what animal passed, how long ago, how fast it was moving, whether it was alarmed or calm. This kind of tracking knowledge takes years, even decades, to develop fully, and researchers studying surviving traditional trackers, including the famous sand trackers of the Kalahari, whose skills have been documented extensively by anthropologists and are still actively used and taught today, describe a level of environmental literacy that borders on the difficult to comprehend for those of us raised in environments saturated with text and screens rather than dust and grass. A skilled tracker can sometimes determine not just what animal passed and roughly when, but its approximate size, its physical condition, even something of its emotional state, whether it moved calmly or in alarm, all from signs invisible or meaningless to an untrained eye. The men moved slowly, spread loosely across the landscape, communicating sometimes through quiet words, sometimes through simple hand gestures developed and refined over countless shared hunts. Spears. By this point in human history, often fire-hardened wooden spears, sometimes tipped with carefully worked stone points, are carried but not yet readied. Readiness, in successful hunting, is mostly mental, an alert, patient watchfulness maintained across hours of otherwise unremarkable walking. Much of the actual hunt, when reconstructed honestly, consists of this: walking, watching, reading signs, walking further. The dramatic moment of the kill itself, when it happens at all, since many hunting expeditions across the ethnographic record end without any kill whatsoever, typically occupies only a small fraction of the total time invested. Persistence hunting. A technique still practiced by some sand groups today, and believed by researchers to be one of humanity's oldest hunting methods, illustrates this pattern especially clearly. In persistence hunting, hunters identify a target animal and simply pursue it, on foot, often for hours, in the heat of the day, relying on the fact that the human body's unusual cooling system, extensive sweating combined with minimal body hair, allows humans to maintain a steady pace over long distances in heat that eventually overwhelms most four-legged prey, which must periodically stop to pant and cool down. Eventually, the animal becomes too exhausted and overheated to continue, and the hunters, who have paced themselves carefully across the same hours, are able to make the kill with comparatively little danger or difficulty. This method demands extraordinary patience above almost any other quality. Hours of steady jogging, in heat, under open sky, with no guarantee of success at the end of it. And indeed, by every account, the success rate of any individual hunting expedition was, and remains, among groups who still hunt this way, considerably lower than popular imagination assumes. Failure, or simply returning empty-handed, was a normal, frequent, unremarkable outcome, woven into the ordinary texture of these days exactly as success was. This matters for understanding the deeper emotional rhythm of Paleolithic life. A people for whom failed hunts were simply normal, expected, frequent occurrences would necessarily have developed psychological and social mechanisms for handling that frequent disappointment without despair. Mechanisms we can still glimpse, faintly, in the easy humor and lack of dramatic self-recrimination anthropologists often observe among hunters in traditional societies returning from an unsuccessful day's pursuit. Tomorrow, after all, was simply tomorrow. There would be other tracks. Other chances. The men walk on. The grass moves in the wind. Somewhere ahead, perhaps, an animal grazes, unaware, or perhaps already alert, already moving away. Either way, the patient watching continues, hour after quiet hour, the true center of gravity of the hunting day resting not in any single dramatic moment but in this long, accumulated, attentive stillness. By the time the sun reaches its highest point, something shifts across the entire landscape, not just within the human camp, but everywhere, among every creature sharing that stretch of savanna or forest or coastal plain. The heat of equatorial and subtropical midday, in the environments where so much of early human evolution unfolded, is not a minor discomfort. It is a genuine physiological challenge, one that virtually every animal in these ecosystems has evolved some strategy to manage. Lions sleep through the heat of the day, conserving energy for cooler hunting hours at dawn and dusk. Many antelope species seek shade and stillness. The entire visible world, around midday, tends toward quiet. Early humans, by every reasonable reconstruction, followed this same broad pattern. The intense activity of morning, the fire tending, the foraging, the tracking, gives way, as the sun climbs toward its peak, to a long stretch of comparative inactivity. This is, in a sense, one of the most underappreciated features of Paleolithic daily life, the sheer amount of rest built into the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary day. Not rest as a reward for work completed, in the way modern life sometimes frames relaxation, but rest as a built-in, expected, entirely unremarkable feature of how a day simply moved, dictated not by any moral judgment about productivity, but by the plain physical reality of heat and the body's need to manage it. Picture the camp at this hour. Those who went out gathering have, in many cases, already returned, or paused their foraging in whatever shade presented itself along the way. Those still in camp, perhaps tending small children, perhaps recovering from the previous day's exertions, perhaps simply present because not every person needed to forage every single day, settle into whatever patches of shade the camp offers. Trees, where available, provided the most reliable shade, and anthropological observation suggests that camps were frequently sited with exactly this consideration in mind, proximity to shade-giving trees ranking alongside proximity to water as a major factor in choosing where to settle, even temporarily. Bodies stretch out on the ground, sometimes on simple mats of woven grass or animal hide, sometimes directly on bare earth, cooled somewhat by the shade above. Conversation, which filled the brisk activity of morning, slows here into something quieter, murmured words, long silences, the occasional soft laugh. Sleep, during these midday hours, was almost certainly common, though probably lighter and shorter than the deep sleep of full night. Researchers studying contemporary hunter-gatherer and small-scale traditional societies have repeatedly documented an afternoon rest period, sometimes called a midday nap, though the term undersells its cultural and physiological significance. That appears with striking consistency across vastly different climates and cultures, from the deserts of the Kalahari to the rainforests of South America. This pattern, sometimes called biphasic sleep by researchers who study it, may represent something close to a deeply ingrained human default. A pattern only recently disrupted, on a historical timescale, by industrial work schedules and the demands of artificial lighting, which together pushed human societies toward the single, consolidated nighttime sleep period most modern people now consider normal and natural, even though it may, in the deeper view, be the unusual pattern rather than the typical one. There is something worth sitting within that idea, as you yourself rest right now, in whatever quiet hour you have found for this story. The very impulse that might draw a person to sleep during daylight hours, or to crave a slow, unhurried rest in the middle of an otherwise busy stretch of time, may not be laziness or weakness at all, but something considerably older than any modern judgment about productivity. A rhythm written into the body across an almost unimaginable span of time, long before clocks, long before schedules, long before the very idea that rest needed to be earned or justified. During this long midday stillness, certain quiet tasks might continue, the kind of low-effort work compatible with heat, shade, and a half-drowsy state of mind. An older member of the group might work slowly at a piece of hide, softening it through patient, repetitive motion. Someone might begin shaping a stone tool, chipping carefully, unhurriedly, at a piece of flint, each strike considered, each result examined before the next strike falls. Children, too young to forage far, play quietly nearby, or not so quietly, their voices rising occasionally in the particular delighted shrieks children have produced in every era of human existence, before subsiding again into focused, absorbed play. This pause, more than almost any other part of the day, gives the lie to the popular image of constant Paleolithic struggle. Here, in the heat-soaked middle hours, is simply rest. Unremarkable. Unhurried. As fundamental to the shape of the day as the activity that bookended on either side. The shadows shift slowly as the sun begins its long afternoon descent. Eventually, there is no precise moment, no alarm, simply a gradual return of motivation as the worst heat passes, bodies begin to stir again. The gatherers who paused mid-foraging pick up their digging sticks once more. Those who rested in camp rouse themselves, stretching, perhaps drinking from whatever water container is at hand. The day's second half begins, as unhurried in its starting as the first half was in its ending. As the worst heat of the day eases, certain members of the group turn their attention to a category of activity that, more than almost any other, distinguishes the human story from that of every other animal sharing the landscape, the deliberate, patient shaping of tools. It is worth pausing here to consider just how much of human history, the vast, overwhelming majority of it, is named, by archaeologists, after stone. The Paleolithic, the word itself meaning simply old stone, stretches back roughly 2.5 million years and continues until around 12,000 years ago, when the first stirrings of agriculture begin to appear in parts of the world. Within that almost incomprehensibly long span, stone tools represent one of our most abundant and most informative sources of evidence about how life was actually lived. Picture a man. Though toolmaking, like every other Paleolithic activity, was certainly not the exclusive province of any one sex, and evidence increasingly suggests broader participation than older assumptions allowed, sitting cross-legged in dappled afternoon shade, a small pile of stones gathered earlier from a nearby riverbed laid out before him. He selects one stone, a core, in the language archaeologists use today. Turning it over slowly in his hands, examining its shape, its grain, the way light catches its surface. Experienced toolmakers, studies of both ancient tools and modern traditional craftspeople suggest, develop an intimate, almost intuitive understanding of how different stone types fracture, which directions a blow will travel through the material, which angles produce a sharp, useful edge, which produce only useless shards. He raises a second stone, a hammerstone, and brings it down against the core with a precise, controlled strike. A flake breaks away. Not randomly, but along a predictable line determined by the angle and force of the blow, by the internal structure of the stone itself, by a kind of physical knowledge embedded so deeply in the hands and eyes of an experienced toolmaker that it might never be consciously articulated at all, only demonstrated, repeated, absorbed by watching apprentices over months and years. This process, called flint knapping by modern archaeologists who have worked to relearn these ancient techniques through painstaking experimentation, produces, in skilled hands, tools of remarkable sophistication. Early stone tools, the simple choppers and flakes associated with the very beginning of the Paleolithic, gradually gave way, across hundreds of thousands of years, to far more refined forms. Hand axes shaped with symmetrical precision, smaller blades struck with controlled, repeated technique, eventually, much later in the Paleolithic, composite tools combining stone points with wooden handles, bound together with plant fiber cordage or animal sinew. Each strike of stone against stone makes a particular sound, a sharp, clean crack, different from almost any other sound in the natural world, distinct enough that researchers studying ancient sites can sometimes identify tool-making areas partly through the dense scatter of stone debris left behind, evidence of countless afternoons exactly like this one, repeated across hundreds of thousands of years, at countless sites, by countless hands now long since returned to dust. The toolmaker works with what can only be described as patient absorption. Strike. Examine. Turn. Strike again. A skilled flint knapper, modern experimental archaeology has shown, can produce a basic, functional cutting tool in a matter of minutes, but the most refined tools, symmetrical hand axes, finely pressure-flaked points appearing later in the Paleolithic, could require considerably longer, the maker working slowly toward a kind of aesthetic as well as functional precision. This point deserves real attention. Archaeologists studying the most refined stone tools of the later Paleolithic have noted that many show a level of symmetry and finish exceeding what pure function would strictly require. Some hand axes, for instance, display a careful, almost sculptural symmetry that researchers believe may reflect something beyond pure utility. Perhaps an emerging aesthetic sense, a pride in craftsmanship, even a kind of display of skill that might have carried social value within the group, signaling competence, patience, intelligence to other members of the band. In other words, even here, in the deep Paleolithic, in an activity bound up entirely with practical survival, something like art, something like pride in a job well done, may already have been present, however faintly, however differently expressed than we would recognize it today. Around the toolmaker, other quiet afternoon crafts proceed in parallel. Someone scrapes a hide stretched across a frame, working slowly to remove fat and tissue, preparing it to become clothing or a sleeping mat or a container. Cordage, the simple but vital technology of twisted plant fiber, used for everything from binding tools to constructing carrying nets, gets twisted slowly between palms, fiber by fiber, a skill so fundamental to human technological life that some archaeologists consider it nearly as significant as stone tool use itself, even though it leaves far less obvious trace in the archaeological record, since plant fiber decays where stone endures. These crafting activities, much like the gathering and toolmaking that filled earlier parts of the day, unfold without urgency. There is no deadline pressing on the toolmaker, no quota of finished tools required by sundown. The work proceeds at the pace the material allows and the maker's patience sustains, sometimes interrupted by conversation, by a child's question, by the simple pause of resting tired hands before continuing. This unhurried quality, present across so much of Paleolithic daily activity, stands in real contrast to the pace of much modern work, structured as it so often is around external deadlines, productivity targets, the abstract pressure of clock time itself. The toolmaker of the deep past certainly, worked hard, often, over the course of a lifetime, accumulating real skill and real knowledge. But the texture of that work, hour by hour, carried a different quality than much modern labor. Paced by the task itself rather than by an external schedule, interruptible without consequence, woven seamlessly into a day that held space equally for work, rest, conversation, and simple presence. The afternoon light shifts slowly toward gold as these quiet crafts continue, stone striking stone, hands working hide and fiber, voices murmuring low across the warm, settling air. Scattered around the edges of these afternoon scenes, the tool-making, the hide-scraping, the quiet cordage twisting, children move through their own parallel world, one that looked, in its essential shape, remarkably like the unstructured, exploratory childhoods anthropologists have documented across virtually every hunter-gatherer society ever studied. This deserves real attention, because the contrast with much of modern childhood is striking. There were no schools in the Paleolithic, no formal lessons, no curriculum, no testing. And yet children, across this vast stretch of human history, somehow grew into fully competent adults, carrying immense practical knowledge, sophisticated technical skill, and deep social understanding. How did this happen, without anything resembling formal education as we now understand it? Anthropologists who have spent extended time among contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. The Hadza, the Jew/Hoansi San, the AKA of Central Africa, and others, describe a pattern of learning built almost entirely on observation, imitation, and play, unfolding gradually across years rather than being delivered in concentrated lessons. A toddler, too young for any real task, simply watches. Watches an adult work stone. Watches another dig for tubers. Watches the careful, repeated motions of cordage twisting, of fire tending, of butchering meat after a successful hunt. This watching is not idle. Researchers studying child development in these societies have found that children absorb an enormous amount of practical knowledge simply through sustained, repeated observation, long before they are physically capable of attempting the tasks themselves. As children grow a little older, perhaps 4, 5, 6 years old, observation gives way gradually to imitation, almost always in the form of play rather than directed instruction. A small child might pick up a stick and pretend to dig, mimicking the motions seen in adults, though producing no actual food. Another might gather pebbles and attempt, clumsily, to strike one against another, imitating toolmaking long before any functional tool results from the effort. Crucially, this imitative play is rarely corrected harshly, by the accounts anthropologists have gathered. Adults in observed hunter-gatherer societies tend toward a notably permissive, patient style of instruction, offering occasional guidance, sometimes a brief demonstration, but rarely the kind of sustained correction or criticism common in more formal educational settings. Mistakes are simply part of the long, unhurried process of becoming competent, met more often with mild amusement than disapproval. By perhaps 7 or 8 years old, in many traditional foraging societies, children begin actually contributing in small but real ways to the group's food supply, gathering small, easily identified plants, catching insects, occasionally bringing back genuinely useful finds from their wandering, exploratory play near camp. This contribution grows steadily across adolescence, the line between play and real work blurring gradually rather than shifting abruptly at any single defined point. This pattern, learning through years of unstructured observation and imitative play, gradually shading into genuine competence and contribution, likely characterized human childhood across an enormous span of the Paleolithic, shaping not just practical skill but, researchers increasingly believe, cognitive development itself. The kind of flexible, exploratory, self-directed learning typical of foraging childhoods has been linked, in modern psychological research on play more broadly, to strong outcomes in problem-solving, creativity, and social cooperation, suggesting that this ancient pattern of childhood learning may have been, in its own way, remarkably effective, even without anything resembling formal schooling. Beyond practical skills, children in these afternoon scenes absorb something else, harder to name precisely but no less important, the social fabric of the group itself. Watching adults interact, cooperating, occasionally disagreeing, resolving small conflicts, sharing food, offering comfort. Children learn the unwritten rules governing how a small, tightly interdependent group of people manages to live together, day after day, year after year, without the kind of formal law or external authority modern societies rely on. Cooperation, sharing, and a strong cultural emphasis on equality appear, across the anthropological record of hunter-gatherer societies, with remarkable consistency. Food, in particular, is very often shared widely across the group, regardless of who specifically found or killed it, a pattern researchers believe likely characterized much of Paleolithic social life as well, given how consistently it appears across vastly different foraging societies and vastly different environments around the world today. This sharing was not necessarily born of pure altruism. It likely functioned, in part, as a kind of insurance system, ensuring that the inevitable bad luck of an unsuccessful hunt or a poor foraging day for any individual or family did not translate into hunger, because the group as a whole absorbed and smoothed out these individual fluctuations in fortune. Children, watching this constant, unremarked sharing happen around them daily, absorbed the underlying value almost without anyone needing to state it directly. This was simply how the world worked. This was simply what people did. As the afternoon light continues its slow shift toward the gold and amber of late day, the children's play gradually quiets. The way children's play across every era of human history has gradually quieted as the day wears on and small bodies grow tired. Some drift toward adults, seeking comfort or simple proximity. Others continue their absorbed play a while longer, chasing the day's last bursts of energy before evening settles in. And somewhere in all of this unstructured, unhurried, endlessly repeated daily experience, watching, imitating, playing, slowly contributing. An entire complex culture, an entire body of practical and social knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to the next, with no books, no schools, no written record at all. Only the patient, accumulated weight of countless ordinary afternoons, each one looking very much like the one before it, and very much like the one that would follow. As the sun begins its real descent toward the horizon, the light across the landscape changes character entirely. The harsh, flattening glare of midday gives way to something softer. Long shadows stretching east from every tree and rock, the grass itself seeming to glow faintly gold, the whole world taking on the particular warm cast that photographers, many hundreds of thousands of years later, would come to call the golden hour, without ever knowing how many generations of human eyes had watched this exact same transformation, evening after evening, across an almost incomprehensible span of time. This is, for the gatherers and hunters scattered across the landscape since morning, the signal to begin making their way back toward camp. There is no clock to consult, no fixed time at which return is mandated. The decision is governed by something more fundamental, the simple practical knowledge, carried by every adult and most older children, of how much daylight remains, how far camp lies, and how dangerous the landscape becomes once true dark falls. Darkness, in environments without artificial light, arrives with a finality modern people rarely experience. There is no gradual transition extended by streetlights or the glow of nearby towns. Once the sun fully sets, in regions near the equator, true darkness follows within perhaps 20 or 30 minutes, and that darkness is often genuinely difficult to navigate, particularly across unfamiliar or uneven ground. Predators, too, shift their own patterns as evening approaches. Many of the large carnivores sharing the Paleolithic landscape, lions, leopards, hyenas, become considerably more active around dusk and through the night, having spent the heat of the day resting much as the human gatherers themselves had rested. Returning to the safety of camp before full dark was not, therefore, simply a matter of convenience. It carried real survival weight, a calculation made instinctively, through long practical experience, by every member of the group old enough to range away from camp on their own. And so, as the light turns gold and then begins to deepen toward amber, small groups begin converging back toward the central camp from different directions. The gatherers, bags now heavy with the day's accumulated finds, walking the familiar path back with the particular satisfied tiredness that follows a full day of physical activity, the hunters, perhaps carrying the substantial weight of a successful kill, or perhaps walking back empty-handed, their tiredness colored with the milder disappointment of an unsuccessful day, though rarely anything approaching despair, given how routine such outcomes were. There is something worth noting in the simple physical experience of this walk back. The body, after a day spent largely on its feet, walking, digging, tracking, working, carries a particular kind of fatigue, not the sharp, urgent exhaustion of crisis, but the deep, settled tiredness of accumulated ordinary effort, the kind that makes the eventual stillness of evening rest feel earned and deeply satisfying rather than simply necessary. Modern sleep researchers have noted, with real interest, that this pattern, substantial physical activity spread across the day, naturally building toward evening fatigue, aligns closely with what we now understand about healthy sleep regulation. Bodies that move significantly during daylight hours, and are exposed to substantial natural light, tend to produce stronger, more naturally regulated sleep signals come evening. The Paleolithic day, entirely without intending to optimize anything, may have constructed something close to an ideal template for healthy sleep, simply as an incidental consequence of how foraging life necessarily unfolded. As the various small groups near camp, voices begin to carry across the stilling evening air. Greetings called out, questions about the day's success, the particular easy informality of people who have shared every single day of their lives with one another, who hold no real concept of strangers within their own small band, who have built, across years and years of exactly this kind of daily proximity, the deep, unshakable familiarity that comes only from genuinely constant shared experience. Children who remain near camp during the day's heat run out to meet returning parents, eager to see what the bags hold, eager simply for the reassurance of reunion after the day's separation. This pattern, too, a deep, embodied relief at reunion after even a relatively brief separation, likely runs very deep in human psychology, shaped across the countless generations during which separation from one's group carried genuine risk, and reunion represented genuine, tangible safety restored. The light continues its slow fade. The sky above begins its own transformation, gold giving way to deeper orange, then to the soft purples and blues that precede true dusk. Somewhere, a bird calls its last evening song before falling silent for the night. The wind, often stronger during the heat of the day, begins to settle into the particular calm stillness so many environments take on as evening deepens. And the camp, scattered groups now reunited into something resembling its full evening composition, turns its attention toward the work and pleasure of the night ahead, the fire to be built up properly, the food to be prepared and shared, and eventually, the long settling toward sleep that would carry everyone through to another morning, very much like this one, and very much like the one that had come before. As true dusk settles over the camp, the fire becomes, once again, the natural center around which everything else organizes itself, exactly as it was in the gray hour before dawn, only now the group gathers around it not to begin the day, but to close it. The fire that was carefully tended that morning, and likely fed steadily at intervals throughout the day by whoever remained near camp, now gets built up properly for the evening. More substantial branches added, the flames allowed to grow taller, throwing a wider circle of warm, flickering light out into the gathering dark. This moment, repeated with only minor variation across an almost unimaginable number of evenings throughout human history, deserves real attention, because many researchers consider the controlled use of fire to be one of the most transformative developments in our entire evolutionary story. Arguably influencing human development as profoundly as any other single technology our species has ever adopted. Cooking, made possible by reliable fire, fundamentally changed the energetic equation of human existence. Cooked food is, in simple physical terms, considerably easier to digest than raw food. The application of heat breaks down tough plant fibers and connective tissue in meat, releasing nutrients and calories that would otherwise require far more metabolic effort to extract, or that might not be extractable at all through raw digestion alone. Some researchers, including primatologist Richard Wrangham, have argued that this dramatic increase in dietary efficiency, made possible by cooking, may have helped fuel the evolution of larger human brains. Organs that demand enormous amounts of metabolic energy relative to their size, energy that a diet of raw food alone might struggle to reliably provide. Beyond its nutritional impact, fire reshaped the entire social and temporal structure of human evenings. Before reliable fire, the descent of full darkness likely meant, for most practical purposes, the end of meaningful activity until the following dawn. Vision simply too limited, predator risk too significant, to do much beyond huddling together for warmth and safety. Fire changed this completely. It extended the useful, social, wakeful portion of each day by hours, pushing back the boundary of darkness, creating an entirely new category of human experience, the evening, as a distinct social and psychological space, separate from both the working day and the unconscious night. Around the built-up evening fire, the group settles into the particular comfortable proximity of people who have spent their whole lives in close physical community with one another. Food, gathered or hunted across the day, gets prepared and shared. The specifics of this evening meal varied enormously, of course, across different environments, different seasons, different moments in the vast span of the Paleolithic. Sometimes it meant roasting meat from a successful hunt, the fat crackling and dripping into the fire, the smell rich and unmistakable, drawing the whole camp's attention even before the meat was ready. Sometimes it meant a simpler meal built from the day's gathered plants. Tubers buried directly in hot coals to roast, nuts cracked open and eaten, fruit shared out among the group. Sharing, as noted earlier, was not a peripheral feature of this meal but very often its central social function. Anthropological observation of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups describes meat sharing in particular as carrying significant social weight. Successful hunters very often distributing the bulk of a kill to others in the group rather than primarily consuming it themselves, a pattern that, far from representing pure altruism, likely functioned as a sophisticated long-term social strategy, building reciprocal obligation and group cohesion that would, in turn, support the hunter himself during the inevitable future days when his own hunting luck ran thin. The meal itself unfolds slowly, without the structured courses or fixed mealtime conventions of later, more complex societies. People eat as food becomes ready, sometimes all together, sometimes in a more staggered, informal way. Children receive food readily, often prioritized in distribution, fed by whichever adult happens to have something ready at hand, regardless of strict biological parentage. Another pattern, sometimes called cooperative breeding by researchers, that appears to have deep roots in human social evolution, distinguishing our species from most other primates, among whom maternal care tends to be far more exclusively concentrated on a single mother-infant bond. As the meal winds down, replaced by the looser, more relaxed activity of simple evening togetherness, conversation deepens in a way distinct from the practical chatter of daytime foraging or the focused quiet of toolmaking. This is, by virtually every anthropological account of foraging society studied, the time of day most associated with storytelling, with extended conversation, with the particular kind of unhurried social connection that the demands of daytime subsistence work simply do not accommodate. Researchers studying the Jew/Hoansi-San people of the Kalahari, in a particularly well-known study examining exactly this pattern, found that daytime conversation tended to focus overwhelmingly on practical matters, economic complaints, criticism, troubleshooting practical problems. Evening conversation, by contrast, shifted dramatically toward storytelling, song, and more purely social, relationship-oriented talk. Daytime, in other words, was for solving problems. Evening, around the fire, was for something else entirely, for the deeper social and cultural work of maintaining bonds, transmitting values, and simply enjoying one another's company after the labor of the day was done. The fire crackles and pops softly in the deepening dark. Sparks occasionally lift upward, glowing briefly before fading into the night sky above, where stars are beginning to emerge in genuinely overwhelming numbers. A sky utterly unpolluted by artificial light, displaying a depth and clarity almost impossible for most modern people to fully imagine, accustomed as we are to skies washed pale by the glow of cities. And it is to this fire, this gathered company, this deepening dark sky overhead, that we turn next, to the stories told, the songs sung, and the slow, gradual drift toward the sleep that would carry the camp through to another dawn. As full darkness settles completely over the landscape, the fire becomes the single point of light and warmth in an otherwise vast, dark world, a small, glowing island of human presence surrounded on every side by the immense quiet of the African night, or whatever landscape a particular band happened to call home in whatever particular era of the deep Paleolithic we choose to imagine. This is, by careful anthropological reconstruction, the time of storytelling. One of the oldest and most universal of all human cultural activities, one whose origins almost certainly stretch back far beyond any written record, far beyond even the earliest cave art, into a period of human history about which we can only speculate, though speculation grounded in patient comparative research across virtually every human culture that anthropologists have ever studied. The particular study mentioned earlier, examining conversation patterns among the Jews/Hoansi San, found that the stories told around evening fires covered remarkably consistent ground across observed sessions, stories about ancestors, about animals, about the deep past, often involving subtle moral or social lessons woven naturally into engaging, entertaining narrative, rather than delivered as explicit, didactic instruction. Researchers studying this pattern have proposed that firelit storytelling may have served several deeply important functions simultaneously, beyond simple entertainment. It transmitted crucial practical and environmental knowledge across generations, in a form far more memorable and engaging than dry, direct instruction could ever achieve. It reinforced shared cultural values and social norms, helping bind a small, interdependent group together through shared narrative and shared meaning. And it provided, simply, a deeply satisfying form of evening entertainment and relaxation after the physical demands of the day, something the human mind and body seem to crave, across every culture ever studied, after sustained periods of active work. Imagine, then, an elder of the group, perhaps the same woman who woke first that morning, listening quietly to the pre-dawn dark. Beginning a story now, in the firelight, her voice falling into the particular rhythmic, practiced cadence of someone who has told this story, or stories like it, many times before, to many gathered faces across many evenings stretching back through her own long life. The story might concern the origin of some particular animal's distinctive markings or behavior. It might recount the deeds, real or embellished, of an ancestor several generations past. It might simply describe, in vivid, sensory detail, some past hunt or past journey, the kind of story that, through repeated telling, gradually accumulates the polished, satisfying shape of well-worn narrative. Children, by every account of similar contemporary gatherings, listen with rapt, genuine attention, often lying close against parents or older siblings, faces lit by the orange flicker of firelight, eyes growing heavy even as they fight to stay awake for just a little more of the story. This particular scene, children drifting towards sleep while being told stories by firelight, surrounded by the people who love and protect them, may represent one of the oldest, most continuously repeated experiences in the entire human story, one that, in slightly different form, continues even now, in households across the modern world, wherever a parent reads a bedtime story to a drowsy child before the final descent into sleep. The stories continue for some while, the fire slowly burning down from its earlier evening height, requiring only occasional, smaller additions of fuel now rather than the more substantial feeding it demanded earlier. Voices around the fire grow quieter, more intermittent, punctuated by longer stretches of comfortable silence as the deep tiredness of the day's physical activity begins, finally, to assert itself fully. One by one, individuals within the group begin drifting toward actual sleep. There is, again, no fixed bedtime, no external schedule governing this transition. Bodies simply grow heavy, eyelids simply grow difficult to hold open, and people, one by one, settle into whatever sleeping arrangement the group typically used, often close together for warmth and safety, sometimes on simple beds of gathered grass or leaves, sometimes on animal hide, the specific arrangement varying by climate, by available materials, by the particular customs of each distinct group. Sleep itself, as discussed earlier, likely came in a somewhat different pattern than the single, consolidated nighttime block many modern people consider standard. Some individuals may wake briefly during the night, perhaps to tend a fire, perhaps simply drifting naturally between lighter and deeper phases of sleep, perhaps to murmur briefly with another wakeful member of the group before settling back into rest. This pattern, again, mirrors what researchers have documented among contemporary small-scale societies still living largely without artificial light. Sleep is a somewhat more flexible, responsive process than the single uninterrupted block modern sleep hygiene advice often holds up as the singular ideal. Outside the small circle of fading firelight, the night continues its own vast, ancient activity. Nocturnal animals move through the dark landscape, hunting and foraging according to their own rhythms. The stars will slowly overhead, following their patient, ancient path across the sky, exactly as they had the night before, exactly as they would the night after, exactly as they had for the countless nights stretching back across the entire span of human existence and far, far beyond it, into the deep geological time before any human eye had ever opened to watch them. Within the camp, breathing slows. Bodies settle. The last embers of the fire glow softly, pulsing gently in the dark, the same small patient heart that had greeted the very first stirring of the day now keeping its quiet watch as the group it warms drifts, one by one, into the deep stillness of sleep. And so the day closes, much as it began, in quiet. In stillness. In the patient, unhurried rhythm of bodies moving in close accordance with light and dark, hunger and rest, the ancient, steady pulse that carried our species across an almost unimaginable stretch of time, long before clocks, long before cities, long before almost everything that fills a modern day, and yet, in its essential shape, perhaps not so very different from the quiet rest you yourself are settling into right now. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from trying to hold the true scale of the Paleolithic in mind, even briefly. 2.5 million years. That is the span we have been moving through, in this slow walk across a single, composite, representative day. 2.5 million years, across which countless individual humans and human ancestors woke before dawn, listened to the dark, tended fires, walked across landscapes searching for food, rested through the worst heat of midday, worked stone and hide and fiber with patient hands, watched children grow into competent adults through years of unstructured play and observation, gathered each evening around firelight to share food and stories, and drifted, eventually, into sleep, beneath skies far darker and far more thickly scattered with stars than most modern humans will ever have the chance to witness. Modern written history, by contrast, the stretch of time covered by actual written records, by the kings and wars and migrations and inventions that fill most popular accounts of history, covers perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 years. A vanishingly small fraction, when set against the true span of human and pre-human existence. If the entire Paleolithic were compressed into a single 24-hour day, all of written history, every pyramid and empire and revolution we typically associate with the very idea of history, would occupy less than the final 3 minutes before midnight. This is worth sitting with, in the quiet stillness of wherever you are right now, because it reframes something important about what normal human experience actually looks like, when measured honestly across the true span of our species' existence. The dramatic, eventful, rapidly changing world many of us now inhabit, filled with cities, screens, schedules, deadlines, constant novelty and constant stimulation, represents an almost vanishingly recent and historically unusual development. The deep, settled, repetitive rhythm we have spent this story walking through, wake with first light, forage or hunt through the day's cooler hours, rest through the heat, gather again at evening, sleep beneath open sky, represents, by stark contrast, something far closer to the true, long-run baseline of human experience. None of this is meant to suggest that Paleolithic life was simple, or easy, or free from real hardship. It was not. Disease, injury, occasional violence, the constant underlying uncertainty of food supply in difficult seasons or difficult years, these were real and serious features of life across this vast span of time, and it would be a disservice to flatten them entirely out of the picture in pursuit of a comfortable, idealized image of the deep past. But it is equally a disservice to imagine this entire span of human existence as one of constant crisis, constant struggle, constant dramatic event. The patient, painstaking work of archaeologists, anthropologists, and researchers studying contemporary hunter-gatherer societies has, across decades of careful study, assembled a quieter, more nuanced picture than either extreme, a picture of ordinary days filled mostly with ordinary activity. Walking, watching, working with patient hands, resting through heat, gathering at evening, talking, laughing, telling stories, and sleeping, beneath skies our distant ancestors knew far more intimately than most of us ever will. There is something, perhaps, worth carrying forward from this long, slow walk through deep time, as you yourself drift now toward whatever rest you are seeking. The particular rhythm we have traced across this composite day. Movement balanced against rest, work balanced against unhurried social connection, the body's own signals of hunger and fatigue and rising heat governing the shape of activity far more than any external clock or schedule, may represent something considerably more aligned with our deepest biological inheritance than the pace many of us now keep, surrounded by artificial light, structured by abstract schedules, often disconnected from the direct, embodied experience of weather and season and the movement of the sun across an open sky. You cannot, of course, return to that world directly. None of us can. The world has changed too completely, too irreversibly, across the brief flash of written history that followed this vast preceding span. But perhaps there is something quietly restorative simply in remembering, every now and again, that the particular tiredness you feel at the end of a long day, the particular comfort of warmth and stillness as you settle toward sleep, the particular pleasure of a story told slowly in a darkened room. These are not modern inventions, not personal quirks, not signs of anything unusual or in need of correction. They are, instead, some of the oldest, most thoroughly tested, most deeply embedded patterns our species carries within it. Patterns refined across 2.5 million years of patient repetition. Patterns that carried our ancestors safely through bodies of time so vast that the entire span of recorded human history amounts to barely a flicker by comparison. The fire, in our composite day, has burned down now to its last quiet embers. The stars continue their slow, patient will overhead, indifferent to the small dramas of any single human life, exactly as they always have been, exactly as they always will be. And somewhere, in that vast, dark, star-scattered quiet, a body that has walked and worked and watched and rested across the long, unhurried shape of an ordinary Paleolithic day finally, fully, lets go into sleep. May yours do the same. Good night.